This channel is part of the History Hit network.
This is the City of London's Cathedral, yet it is such a famous and much-loved building that it holds a special place in the hearts of all Londoners. The dome is the cathedral's most famous feature, under which countless services and events of national importance have been held. It is also a symbol of defiance, surviving the dreadful fires of the Blitz in 1940, which destroyed so much of this part of London. Its survival was a unique episode in the story of this building, because fire was responsible for destroying the 4 previous churches on this site, and involving the Crown in the rebuilding of the present magnificent St Paul's Cathedral.
The night of the 8th of September 1940 was to mark the start of events that changed the face of London. For 76 consecutive nights, except November 2nd, when bad weather grounded the Luftwaffe, London was attacked like no city before. The city was particularly vulnerable because the River Thames acted as an inextinguishable navigation beacon, and amongst the fire and rubble, the great dome of St Paul stood out as a symbol of hope and survival, like a great ship lifting above the smoke and flame.
Prime Minister Winston Churchill sent a message to the Lord Mayor saying that the cathedral must be saved at all costs. A large group of volunteers, men and women from all walks of life and occupations, joined forces to make up St Paul's Watch.
We were all stationed in the crypt when we arrived, and we were told where we would go for our watch for that night, which might be anywhere in some of the roof spaces. It might be on the galleries outside, and there was one very, very high up, just below the great stone tower, which we were told if it fell on us, there wasn't a hope. It was a more prominent building then than it is today because it wasn't surrounded by so many tall buildings. I'm sure that the effect that St Paul's was saved from major catastrophe was a great symbol to the people. They weren't so much concerned with all the little buildings around, but it was the retention and the safety of the cathedral that was very important to the people, I'm sure, of London.
During the war, the magnificent bells of the cathedral remained silent. They only rang again on the 24th of August 1944, when Paris was liberated.
It seems that it is not just a cathedral which has a strong resonance with the citizens of London. The site of the present St Paul's has long been a popular and obviously special place. In fact, this is the 5th cathedral to have been built on the site and dedicated to the patron saint of the city.
History Hit is a streaming platform that is just for history fans, with fantastic documentaries covering fascinating figures and moments in history from all over the world. We've got unrivaled access to the world's leading historians, with hundreds of documentaries featuring everything from Boudica to the British royal family. We're committed to bringing history fans award-winning documentaries and podcasts that you cannot find anywhere else. Sign up now for a free trial, and Real Royalty fans get 50% off their first 3 months. Just be sure to use code REALROYALTY at checkout.
There are all sorts of myths and legends surrounding the choice of location of the church.
Perhaps the most fantastic story to be connected with this site was recorded by a 10th century cleric, Geoffrey of Monmouth. According to him, St Paul's was the site on which Bladud, the ancient founder of Bath and sometime ruler of Britain, crash-landed a magic flying stone.
No one knows the real reasons, but the first cathedral is recorded as being built in 604 AD, but was burnt down. The Vikings destroyed the second in 962, and the third Saxon building was also consumed by fire. It was left to the Normans to rebuild. They wanted to have a building which reflected the importance of their newly conquered kingdom. It was built of stone from Caen and became the largest building in England.
The policy of William the Conqueror, when he arrived in England, was to set up places of strength all around the country. He would build castles and he would build cathedrals. The tower and spire of the original Norman cathedral were the highest in the world, apart from the city of Ulm in Germany. It was a very splendid place. It was quite magnificent. It took a long time to build, but when it was finished, it was one of the great sights of London. The nave was probably built fairly slowly, and the naves in most cathedrals and in some parish churches were places of meeting. I'll see you in the nave of St Paul's rather than see you under the clock. They did, of course, then degenerate to trading. It became a short cut down to the river, and they drove their cattle and they brought their dogs. It was a terrible smell, and they even said there was a certain amount of soliciting going on in the nave.
The nave was effectively a public place, so for centuries services were conducted in the choir against the background of tradesmen's babble and chatter. Even still, activity became so boisterous that in 1385 ball games were banned from here. Old St Paul's was also the setting for other public events. St Paul's Cross, the Speaker's Corner of medieval London, was the site where impromptu sermons were preached and political grievances debated.
It was also where the Folkmoot would be held. This was a general assembly of citizens to pass on information. It was also to be the place of penance, torture, and execution. The gunpowder plotters were hanged, drawn, and quartered within the shadow of the cathedral's great west doors.
On June the 4th, 1561, fire was yet again to have a drastic effect on the cathedral. During a severe thunderstorm over London, the magnificent spire was struck by lightning, set on fire, and burnt down. It marked the start of the gradual decline of Old St Paul's.
But despite its poor repair, the cathedral maintained its central role in the lives of Londoners. This is largely due to the influence of the Bishop of London, who has his throne, or cathedra, at St Paul's. The bishop is third in the church hierarchy after the archbishops of Canterbury and York, and therefore has always had a close link with the sovereign throughout history.
Obviously, being in the capital city, bishops were found useful as royal servants in various capacities. They were diplomats. Not to put too fine a point on it, sometimes they were the medieval equivalent of MI5. And when Charles I in 1649 came to the block, my predecessor, Bishop Juxon, was allowed to accompany him in his last days and his last hours. And the bishop was there on the scaffold outside the Whitehall banqueting chamber. And he received the king's last words. And the king said to him as he was about to be executed, "Remember."
After the execution, Parliament wanted to know the significance of the king's remarks to Juxon and demanded an explanation. The bishop replied that the king knew he was a little absent-minded and was reminding him to give his George to the Prince of Wales.
The George, which is attached to the Order of the Garter sash, is thought to have been taken into exile by James II. It passed through the Stuart line to Bonnie Prince Charlie's brother, Henry, Cardinal York. He then sold it to the Duke of Wellington's family, where it remains to this day.
The Archbishop of Canterbury, who had been Juxon's predecessor as Bishop of London, Bishop Laud, he had his head chopped off in 1645, having courageously defended himself before Parliament against all charges of treason. And it's an enormous tribute to the legal tradition of this country that friendless, alone, 70, conducting his own defence, he defeated the prosecution for treason, and they couldn't find him guilty as charged. However, they were determined to kill him, so they just passed an Act of Parliament saying that Laud would be beheaded.
Another 17th century bishop, Henry Compton, fared better and escaped execution after the Civil War. However, he is noted as the last bishop to don armour.
Bishop Compton was also in charge of the churches in the American colonies. However, he grew bored of letters about church life there. So he asked them to send seeds and cuttings instead, which he then planted in the gardens of Fulham Palace. And some of the descendants of those early American imports are still growing here today.
From the 11th century onwards, Fulham Palace has been the out-of-city residence for the bishops of London, and for most of that time has been a rural retreat from the hurly-burly of St Paul's.
The name Fulham is derived from Fuller's settlement, which is thought to have been on the bend in the river behind me. The bishops would have enjoyed a very different life here, as the area surrounding the palace was largely rural, up until the 19th century, when industry grew up along the bank.
The bishop had jurisdiction over many aspects of Fulham life, one of which was the leasing of ferrymen to take people across the river from Fulham to Putney. As there was no bridge until 1729, boats were the only means of getting across. The earliest record of payment for this was in 1210, when 1 penny was charged. Just over 60 years later, Robert, the ferryman of Putney, was paid 4 shillings for taking the royal household of Edward I across the river. It might seem a healthy sum for that time, but Robert only had 2 barges, and it took him 2 days to complete the job. Such was the size of King Edward's retinue. Bishop's Park, which stretches along the banks of the river, was given to the public by Bishop Jackson early in the 19th century. There is another listed building in Fulham, adjacent to the Bishop's Park. Craven Cottage was acquired in 1896 by Fulham Football Club, and although fortunes for the club have fluctuated wildly over the last century, it has at least managed to keep the cottage. Plans are now afoot to relocate the building into Bishop's Park, when the now successful club rebuild their stadium. The original palace at Fulham was built within a deep trough, which at one point was a moat. The oldest remaining part of the building now is 16th century. The courtyard would have been where Queen Elizabeth I was greeted when she visited the bishop in the later years of her life. On one such visit in 1600, thieves broke into the palace and stole the Queen's silver psalter, much to the acute embarrassment of the bishop. Meanwhile, St Paul's was falling into a long and steady decline that reached its depth in the Civil War. By the Restoration, the cathedral was a poor shadow of its former self.
The slow deterioration, which had started with a bolt of lightning in 1561, was brought to a dramatic climax on the night of 4th of September 1666, when flames which had ravished 4/5 of the city of London engulfed the old cathedral.
What was to be called the most destructive fire that England had ever seen started on the night of September the 1st in a bakehouse in Pudding Lane. While most of London was still sleeping, the fire that was to devastate so much of the city was quietly smouldering.
Absolutely cheek by jowl, packed tight, land incredibly valuable, people building on it in every possible opportunity. So the houses were packed close together. And of course, they were all made of wood. And the summer of 1666 was a very, very hot summer. And by the time September came, London was a vast, overcrowded tinderbox. An unfortunate baker called Thomas Fariner one evening, presumably, raked out the ashes out of his oven rather carelessly and didn't check to see that all the embers were actually dead. And his house caught fire really more or less in the middle of the night. You've got to remember that their firefighting kit was absolutely hopeless. I mean, just unbelievably hopeless. And I've got 1 or 2 things here. These are all genuine objects from the 17th century. This is a fireman's helmet, which actually does look quite effective. But when you take into account what they used with it, this bucket, which is, I don't know what was in there, half a gallon, and completely hopeless. And this thing, which is rather interestingly called a squirt. And what it is, it's a fireman's hose, but I don't know how much that took, perhaps half a gallon too. So you can imagine that when the place went up in flames, there was very, very little they could do. These were pathetic tools were thrown against it, and the fire got worse and worse.
The King and the Duke of York were both involved in fighting the blaze. The royal brothers organised bucket chains and ordered the demolition of houses, handing out bags of guineas to anyone who helped them. The fact that any sort of organised effort was made to save the city at all was largely due to the King.
When the fire burnt itself out on September the 6th, the city was a blackened ruin. Not only had St Paul's been razed to the ground, but so had the Royal Exchange, the Guildhall, Newgate Jail, Bridewell, the Customs House. 13,200 houses, 87 parish churches, 6 chapels, 52 livery companies, 3 city gates and 4 stone bridges. In all, it was estimated that £10 million worth of damage to buildings and goods had been done, when the annual income of the city was estimated at a mere 12,000.
For days after the fire, the ground still smouldered and was hot enough to scorch the feet. The King had the task of riding outside the city walls, where many Londoners were encamped, to allay their fears about being attacked by the Dutch or the French, and ultimately to lead them back into the city.
Rumours were spreading that the fire had been started deliberately. Early in April of that year, Papists had been arrested, who were plotting to burn down the city. They had planned the fire for the 3rd of September, as they claimed the stars had predicted a major disaster for that day. Ironically, nature was to do the job for them. The monument was erected as a lasting memorial to the events of September 1666. It is 202 feet high, which is the distance it stands from where the fire started.
When it actually came to the fire, people were looking around for a scapegoat, as they would these days. And rather unfortunately, a poor man called Mr. Hubert was wandering around. He was French, which always helps, and he was slightly delinquent, and he was picked on, and he confessed to causing it, and he was given a sort of show trial and hung. But nobody believed it was his fault. Nobody believed it was his fault. And really, the blame finally wasn't attributed.
Out of this disaster, Charles II saw the chance to create a totally new, stone-built metropolis and set up a commission to look into the rebuilding of the city. The man who came up with the most imaginative plans was better known as an astronomer, but was soon to become the age's greatest architect, Christopher Wren.
Wren drew up plans for the new capital within weeks of the fire going out. He proposed streets of 3 different widths and radiating from a central point. However, such large-scale planning was unheard of in England, and no one could stop Londoners rebuilding on the sites of their previous homes and businesses.
Christopher Wren was born in the Pale of the Anglican Church. His father was Dean of Windsor, his uncle was a bishop. He knew the church well. The first design that he produced was a Greek cross design. Now, that looked very much like a continental church, a centrally planned church, and didn't really meet with the approval of the authorities at all. He was asked to produce a model of something that would be an auditory, and the first model that we have in the trophy room here represents that stage of the design. What Wren did was to obtain a royal warrant that gave him the go-ahead, and attached to that was what is now known as the warrant design, although it is the second warrant. That was essentially compromise. They wanted a spire that looked a bit like the spire that was there before. He wanted a dome, so he produced this wonderful design that I think of almost as an architectural joke. Now, in that royal warrant, there was a wonderful let-out clause that said he could make variations. Variations in what was ornamental rather than essential, but like any good architect, he took that absolutely to the limit. And clearly the design that he was working on encompassed a dome that was much closer to what he wanted to begin with.
Clearing the site of the old cathedral was the first task. Initially they tried to use dynamite, but this caused panic amongst the locals who thought it was an earthquake. So the workers were forced to use battering rams and brute force.
During the excavations, a broken slab from a tomb from the old cathedral was found, with the word resurgam, I shall rise again, inscribed on it. It was laid as the foundation stone of the new cathedral. Wren also had the word carved into the exterior, above the great south door, beneath the image of a phoenix rising from the flames. The choir was opened on December the 5th, 1697 for the first service.
When the dome was revealed, Londoners were in awe of its magnificence, which crowned the skyline of Wren's other spires and steeples. By now, Wren was an old man and was not strong enough to lay the last stone, so his son was winched to the top of the dome to put it in its place, some 36 years after his father had laid the first.
Sadly, Wren was criticised for prolonging the work because of mismanagement, as St Paul's workmen became synonymous with slowness. Wren's wages were held back at one point, and it was only through personally petitioning Queen Anne that he recovered all that he was owed. At the end of 1711, Parliament at last declared that St Paul's was complete, and Wren retired to his riverside house near Hampton Court.
13 years later, as a frail old man of 91, Christopher Wren was helped up the steps of St Paul's by his coachman. Nobody seemed to notice him as he sat beneath the dome, watching the sunlight on the stonework of his masterpiece. Having made his way slowly home, he died later that same afternoon. A few days later, his body was brought back to the crypt to be buried.
Wren's Cathedral contains a magnificent collection of rare and ancient books. Over 2,000 were left by Bishop Compton in his will. The rarest book is the first edition of Tyndale's New Testament of 1526. This Bible caused a storm of controversy when it was first printed, with copies publicly burned at St Paul's Cross. The copy here is one of only 3 known to exist in the world. They survived the fire of London because by chance they had been removed from the city for safekeeping earlier in the century. The only other survivor of the flames was the effigy of John Donne, a former Dean of St Paul's and great poet of the day. Wren had wanted there to be no monuments in the cathedral, but when one was erected to the reformist John Howard in 1795, it seemed to open the floodgates. There are now nearly 300. In the crypt, which is the largest in Europe, tribute is paid to many of the great and good. The armed services, science, arts and politics all have a place here.
There are several tombs of major significance in the crypt, including one which stands beneath the central point of the Great Dome. This is where the body of Horatio Nelson lies, within a coffin made from the flagstaff of the French ship L'Orient. The coffin is contained in a crowned casket, which was supposedly made for Cardinal Wolsey. However, Henry VIII took possession of it, and amazingly it remained unused until Nelson's death.
The funeral for this great naval hero was a state occasion, but there was no royal presence. George III wouldn't attend, as he disapproved of Nelson's liaison with Lady Hamilton. Amongst the grand and beautiful memorials lies a simple black marble stone. This is the burial place of Wren, with a Latin inscription, Lector si monumentum requiris circumspice. Reader, if you need a monument, look around you.
These words seem most apt in more than one sense. St Paul's is a memorial to this extraordinary architect. In another sense, Charles II, Wren and all his skilled craftsmen managed to create a monument which captures the spirit and history of the site, which has been at the heart of the life of Londoners practically since the city began.
For centuries, my ancestors have used the River Thames as their principal form of transport in London. It was often the quickest route, but more importantly, it was usually the safest.
Henry VIII would have been familiar with this route, as it must have been one of his favourite journeys, for it took him to perhaps the most splendid and scenic of his many palaces, Hampton Court. But he only acquired it when one of his senior courtiers fell from grace. One of the most striking features of Hampton Court today is this magnificent clock. It was installed by Henry VIII in 1540 as part of his remodelling of the palace, which removed all traces of its previous owner. For Hampton Court was not built by Henry, but by one of his most trusted friends and advisors, Thomas Wolsey.
Wolsey was the king's right-hand man and most trusted advisor. When Wolsey built Hampton Court, he placed a huge set of his coat of arms here above the entrance to the palace. Henry VIII made it his prime task as soon as he took control of the palace to totally remove all traces of Wolsey's stay. Labourers worked by torchlight day and night under huge canvas cloths. They defaced Wolsey's arms over the entrance and above them installed the astronomical clock.
The clock itself is fascinating. As well as telling the hour, day, month and phases of the moon, it also tells the time of high tide at London Bridge. Another feature is on the clock face, the sun revolves around the Earth, as the clock was designed before the discoveries of Galileo.
The reason for all this Tudor vandalism is quite simple. Within the space of 6 months, the two men had completely fallen out. Wolsey descended from being the most powerful minister in the kingdom to being tried for treason. Both Hampton Court and Wolsey had humble origins. In the 13th century, the palace had been a manor owned by the Knights Hospitallers of St. John of Jerusalem. A succession of manor houses followed until in 1514 Thomas Wolsey bought the lease.
Well, Wolsey was an extraordinary character because really he almost came from nowhere. He came from Ipswich, where his later critics said he was the son of a butcher, but his father was an Ipswich grazier. And he joined the church, which was the opening for anybody who wanted to get on in those days, become a churchman. And he joined the household at an early age of Henry VII. But his real break came with the accession of Henry VIII. He soon recognised that in Wolsey he had somebody who would take on the burden of essentially running the state. Wolsey became indispensable to the king. He became very powerful, he became very rich, and he eventually incurred the jealousy of the king. He built what was a very great house indeed, a rival to anything the king owned. Wolsey lived here in immense style, and it was quite clearly a rival to anything that happened at any of the courts of Europe. It was on a courtly scale.
Rumours of Wolsey's lifestyle prompted the king to ask him why he had built a palace that far outshone his own at nearby Richmond. Wolsey reputedly replied, to show how noble a place a subject may offer his sovereign. These turned out to be prophetic words.
Soon after, the lease of Hampton Court was given to the king, and in return the cardinal was allowed the use of Richmond Palace. In effect, they shared the two.
Well, the fallout was catastrophic, but it took a long time. And Henry was very reluctant, even at the very end, to lose the services of the minister, who was quite exceptionally able. And I think that the real problem began with Anne Boleyn. She bore a grudge against Wolsey, and that had a very serious effect on the king's view of the minister. I think his decline in a large measure can be attributed to her influence over the king, trying to drive a wedge between these two individuals who had previously worked very, very closely together. He lost Hampton Court, he was deprived of various offices, and he retreated northwards to York. He lived in some style in York, and that was reported back to the king. And by this time the king was suspicious of what Wolsey was up to, and so officers were sent north to arrest him. Wolsey travelled south, he got as far as Leicester, he stayed in Leicester Abbey, and that's in fact where he died, en route back to London, where almost certainly he would have been tried for treason with the usual Tudor result.
One problem of coping with a household of 500 or 600 is ensuring an adequate supply of fresh water. One of the features of Wolsey's palace was an elaborate water supply system, but Henry had to extend it further.
After only a short stay, the court would leave and not return to the palace until it had been made hospitable again. With a supply of fresh water, larger amounts of people could stay for longer periods in one place. Wolsey had already introduced a system of water conduits, but Henry needed to improve on it. He constructed further conduit houses at Coombe, 3 miles from here, so that fresh water could flow downhill from Kingston to the palace. £100 was set aside for the construction. 3 miles of pipes using 150 tons of lead took the water via Kingston and under the Thames to Hampton Court. Because the conduit houses were so far from the palace, they posed a security risk. Henry was concerned that the water supply could be poisoned by his enemies, so security measures were taken.
Each conduit was built with extra thick walls and doors with double locks. The area surrounding was overseen by the Crown and then sown with thorns to act as a natural deterrent.
Coombe Conduit is still in working order, although it hasn't supplied water to Hampton Court since 1876. Many of the original pipes still run under the houses of Kingston. At the time when the water system was being improved, Kingston was already a busy and prosperous market town. Although it is the oldest of the 3 royal boroughs in England, it was not until 1927 that King George V confirmed the title.
It was given in recognition of Kingston's royal heritage, for it was here that the ancient Saxon kings were crowned.
Edward the Elder was the first to be made king here in 900, and the last was Ethelred the Unready in 979. The coronation stone is thought to be the remains of the ancient throne upon which they sat. A silver coin from the reign of each king is set into the stone plinth. It is likely that the actual coronation service would have taken place in the chapel, which once stood on the site of All Saints' Church. Then the king would be crowned in the open air for the public to see.
From the tower of the church, there is a great view of the river. And in the 16th century, the bell ringers were paid to welcome Queen Elizabeth I as she passed by on the river on her way to Hampton Court. It is also recorded that they were paid not to ring the bells when her successor James I passed by, as he was not so popular.
Kingston Bridge has also played an important role in the fortunes of the town. Along with London Bridge, it was one of the only 2 bridges across the Thames from medieval times. It has been rebuilt over the centuries, but during the 16th century it was deliberately destroyed by the locals. They were trying to prevent the passage of Sir Thomas Wyatt and his followers, who were fighting to stop the marriage of Mary I to the King of Spain in 1554. The citizens managed to stall him for several hours, which helped towards Wyatt's eventual defeat. As a sign of gratitude, Queen Mary granted the town a charter, allowing them a 3rd fish weir and an additional fair. It is said that there was such an abundance of salmon that even the workhouse complained of being fed too much. This prosperous trade is represented in the town's coat of arms, along with a crown to indicate its royal status.
Mary's father, Henry VIII, used Kingston Bridge for his artillery train as he feared for the safety of London Bridge under the excessive weight. The King's procession also crossed here on its way to France in 1520 and the Field of the Cloth of Gold.
In 1546, Henry was again entertaining French ambassadors. This time, Hampton Court was the venue, and the palace was surrounded with gold and velvet tents. For 6 days, they housed the ambassadors' retinue of 200 gentlemen and the 1,300 members of Henry's own court.
This sort of event was not unusual, and to meet such demands, the palace kitchens were immense. They were divided into 19 separate departments, overseeing all aspects of the royal menu.
In Wolsey's time and in Henry VIII's time, the ceremonial centre of the palace was the Great Hall. But what is interesting is that by the 1530s, the emphasis on the Great Hall, in general terms, was declining. And at Hampton Court, it's something of a revival of what Henry viewed as the great medieval tradition of having a great hall. And one can imagine him harking back to Henry V, the great medieval royal heroes, and having this huge baronial hall in the middle of his palace. But it was there that the lower courtiers, at least, dined, hundreds and hundreds of them, up to 600 at a sitting, up to twice a day.
During the reign of Elizabeth I, the Great Hall was often used as a theatre, featuring sumptuous costumes and scenery. Ingenious lighting effects were created, and on one occasion artificial snow was produced.
The palace was also the scene for real-life dramas, several of which included Henry VIII and his successive wives. He spent 3 out of his 6 honeymoons here, including the one with the young Anne Boleyn.
He had their entwined initials carved throughout the palace. As soon as she fell from grace, these were rapidly changed to J for his next wife, Jane Seymour. The work was undertaken with great haste, and many were missed, so the initials of Henry and Anne still remain inseparable to this day. Jane Seymour gave Henry his much-wanted son and heir. Edward VI was christened here in the chapel with much pomp and ceremony. He was carried beneath a rich canopy in a great procession, but only a few days later, Jane Seymour died following complications with the birth. The joyful celebrations within the palace were brought to an abrupt halt. A Bible still stands open as it did in the day of Henry VIII, when he insisted that all visitors should be able to enter any church and read a Bible in English. The book today is the authorized King James version of 1611, which was conceived at Hampton Court. Henry would take Mass and daily prayer in the Holy Day closet overlooking the chapel. It was while in here that he chose to ignore the screams for mercy from his fifth wife, Catherine Howard. It was a tragic end to what had been a promising new beginning for the king. Henry and Catherine were married in a quiet ceremony at Hampton Court. But she was young and he was old. She soon preferred the company, rather unwisely, of some of her former lovers. These included Thomas Culpeper. It was not long before reports were leaked to the king of Thomas being smuggled into the Queen's apartments. At first Henry would not believe it and was devastated by the news. A public declaration of the Queen's adultery was made in the Great Watching Chamber, and her household was immediately dismissed. The Queen was arrested and held captive at the palace. Catherine felt that if she could only talk to the king, she would be able to persuade him of her honour and save her skin. But she was forbidden from seeing him. This frustration and the fear of following the same fate as her cousin Anne Boleyn drove her to take desperate action. Familiar with the king's routine, she knew when he would be in the chapel. This was only a short distance from where she was being held. She managed to break away from her guards and ran as fast as she could down the corridor towards the chapel doors. She hammered at the door, pleading with the king to let her in. It stayed firmly shut. The guards seized her and dragged her screaming back to her quarters. The next time she left her rooms was to start her journey to the Tower and then to the block. She was beheaded on the 13th of February, 1542. She was just 20 years old. The eerie sound of Catherine's supposed shrieks and moans have been heard so often in this corridor that it's been renamed the Haunted Gallery. William III and Mary II were the next monarchs to change the face of Hampton Court. Sir Christopher Wren was chosen to completely renovate the now run-down Tudor palace.
They had grandiose plans for the old place, but cash flow was a problem and many of their dreams were compromised. Fountain Court, which replaced Henry VIII's courtyard, was one of the very few aspects that was completed exactly as they had wished.
In many ways, their purse, I suspect, didn't quite go as far as their ambitions. They, at Hampton Court, what they proposed to do was demolish the entire palace, with the exception of the Great Hall. And that, as a nucleus for a grand Baroque palace, was their initial intention. However, I'm afraid that reality struck, and what we see now at Hampton Court is a reduced version of that initial intention.
William and Mary are the only monarchs in British history to rule as joint heads of state. As the daughter of James II, Mary was Parliament's first choice, but her husband, William of Orange, refused to go to England unless he was given equal status with Mary.
William and Mary began their work on Hampton Court in 1689. 5 years and millions of pounds later, it was still not completed. Then, long before her rooms at the palace were finished, Queen Mary died suddenly of smallpox.
The king was devastated by her death, and all work halted for 3 years. When work resumed again, he oversaw it with attention to the smallest detail, making hundreds of his own suggestions along the way. The state apartments are a wonderful example of the social hierarchy and psychology of the court at the time. A person's status would determine how far into the sequence of rooms he or she was allowed to go.
This is the King's guard chamber.
Would the king actually receive anybody in this room?
No, the king would never come into this room. This was really for the hoi polloi, and this is where people were weeded out. All the court was allowed into this room, and the series of rooms we're going to run into were put together in a very definite pattern. They allowed access to the king, but an access that could be controlled. Now, we're going through into the presence chamber here, and people who would have been allowed through this doorway would have been people of quality. Not only would they have to be of a certain rank, which was of the nobility, or they had to be ministers of state, they would also have to be properly dressed. And you see here we've got a canopy and a throne. But in fact, the king would very rarely have been here. You were very unlikely to have met him here. But even when he wasn't here, courtiers coming in would always bow to the throne, to the empty throne. Now we're coming into one of the most important rooms in this suite of rooms, which is the Privy Chamber. Now, this is where you were much more likely to meet William III. This whole room, together with this most magnificent chandelier, which is rock crystal, would have just glittered and shined, reflected in the mirrors and the candles. It must have been absolutely superb. And this is the withdrawing room. And you can see there's no canopy in here. The king would have sat informally on his chair of state. Also, the lighting is different. We have sconces in here. We don't have a central chandelier. Altogether more informal. And now we're coming out of the withdrawing room, and this is a different province altogether. This is the bedchamber, under the department of the bedchamber, which was supervised by the groom of the stall. A curious title, because the groom of the stall was the only person who was actually allowed, as the title suggests, into his stoolroom or his lavatory. So he was the most intimate member of William's household.
The state apartments are naturally much grander in scale than the private apartments, which are on the ground floor. And here, the king would entertain his friends and family.
In his private dining room, there were often displays of magnificent plate, borrowed from the crown jewels at the Tower of London. They were there to symbolise the wealth and prestige of the king, and were not actually used during the meal.
As well as the buildings, William and Mary paid great attention to the grounds surrounding the palace. In fact, the gardens became so well known that the king and queen were acknowledged as two of the greatest gardeners in Europe.
They experimented with rare and exotic plants from all around the world. Mary would send collectors to the Canary Islands and Virginia to gather native samples. These were then kept in specially built hothouses at the palace. All the loving care William showed his grounds was sadly ironic. This was where he was out riding when his horse stumbled on a molehill and threw the king from his saddle. He broke his collarbone and retired to Kensington Palace to convalesce. He died from pneumonia 3 weeks later. The next and last monarch to use Hampton Court as a home was George II. He added to and refurbished the palace for his queen, Caroline, and also for their 8 children. But all was not domestic bliss. The king and queen were not fond of their eldest son, Frederick, Prince of Wales. The queen was quoted as calling him the greatest ass and the greatest liar and the greatest beast in the whole world. The final straw came when he was expecting his first child with his 3rd wife, Augusta of Saxe-Gotha.
At first, Frederick tried to keep the pregnancy secret, but when the Queen found out, she insisted on being present at the birth. She did not believe that her son could father a healthy child and wanted to make sure that a changeling wasn't put in its place.
The Prince and Princess were staying at Hampton Court with the King and Queen when the Princess went into labour. Frederick dragged his poor wife out of the palace to go to St. James's. When the Queen was told of their departure, she set off in hot pursuit, but did not arrive in time to see the child born.
She met with a chilly reception and returned to the king saying, "I hope to God I never have to see him again." Her wish was granted. Queen Caroline died 2 months later without a reconciliation.
After Queen Caroline's death, the palace was not used as a royal home again. It was divided into grace and favour apartments, and there are still residents today who keep Hampton Court as a living home. One survivor of the palace's sporting heritage is the Royal Tennis Court. Royal or real tennis has been played in England since the 14th century and predates lawn tennis by almost 600 years. Henry VIII was an accomplished athlete and loved to play the game. The king had the first covered court built here in 1532.
The king was a keen gambler, and no game went by without some form of bet being placed on it. Henry was also highly competitive and didn't like to lose, so it must have been a brave or foolish person who either bet against him, or worse, dared to beat him.
As well as money placed on ordinary games, many bizarre wagers were made. In order to win some of the stranger bets, people played on horseback, holding lighted candles, and even in the nude.
Frederick, Prince of Wales, is thought to have died having been hit by a tennis ball. Not a lawn tennis ball, as that wasn't invented until the 1870s, but a real tennis ball, which is solid.
Today's Royal Tennis Club is an enduring legacy of Henry VIII's time here. Remarkably, each of the main royal influences on the palace has a strong link to the present day.
Hampton Court is full of echoes of its rich history and close links with the crown, whether it be tennis or ghostly screams, its gardens or the grace and favour apartments. So it's perhaps ironic that there is no trace of Thomas Wolsey, the man who built it and was responsible for it becoming a royal palace.